critical infrastructure security at scale? How do you make that larger based on the number of people and the flow that we have in an environment like that?
Welcome to the Circuit Magazine, the #1 source of information on protection matters, the industry-leading magazine for all security professionals who want to stay ahead of the game.
Finding career success in large corporations and organizations as an EP specialist. Today, we're very pleased to speak with Chaim Roberts, head of Roberts Risk Solutions, and someone who works inside a very large office complex, building complex, the World Trade Center. I'm here with Sean West. Why is this such an interesting topic? And I'm sort of angling for the use of distinguishing between the family office experience and the really large corporation.
I think it's two completely separate areas, two different arenas completely. From corporate to a family office. Working in a family office, you can pivot pretty easily if the client wants what they want. It's very easy to cut through red tape and get that piece of equipment or that action, something, implement some new strategy they want putting in. On the corporate side, there's a lot more layers of red tape that you need to go through. I'm quite interested to hear from Chaim anyway. It's great hearing people's stories. And he's pivoted from a successful career in the music industry into the corporate security sector. So it'd be good to hear a little bit about that also.
Absolutely. And that cross-pollination, I think, is really fascinating because we've had, Kate Bright from Umbra previously on the podcast where we talked about the transition between EP and PAs. So she came from the world of PAs. And we've had, I think, some others on who have come from a totally different background, but I don't think we've ever had someone from the music industry. So this is quite the pivot. But maybe that in itself is a golden nugget because we're talking about pivoting to work in a really large corporation, and much as maybe working with a celebrity has some sort of pizzazz appeal, closeness to the celebrity. So maybe we have colleagues out there who want to work for the big brand names or the big organizations, and I wonder what they're going to face, either leading the security for those organizations, how can you be everywhere at once, or being a small component in a very large organization. How can you feel connected? I don't know, what considerations do you think our EP community should have when looking at large corporations?
It's difficult. I mean, I've experienced things like that on a smaller scale from when I started my business, and it was small with a small close protection team, and then it grew a number of residential teams, another close protection team. And when things are small, they can be managed quite easily. You can have a nice bond with your team. You get to know everybody intimately. But as it steps out and it gets bigger and the web spreads and it ends up in different countries, you have teams in different countries, it becomes a lot more challenging to manage, say, and have them, the trust, the relationships. So you have to rely a lot on third party. And I guess in the corporate world, if you're a manager of, like Chaim is, running World Trade Center security, he's going to have a lot of trust in third parties of different organizations that he's dealing with. It's not going to be up close and personal he's not going to know his whole team on an intimate level, I guess. So it'll be interesting how he deals with them challenges.
Indeed, scalability. It's the question every small business owner sort of grapples with. And yet, if you're granted it in a corporation, fine. But how do you then deal with it? I think this applies to all EP operators. So let's get into it. Chaim Roberts, big friend of the industry, also massive on Clubhouse. We're going to be speaking with him about protecting the larger organization.
And now, let's meet one of the contributors to the Circuit Magazine.
Effective security management and protecting large facilities. We're here today with Chaim Roberts, founder of Roberts Risk Solution. Elijah and myself are delighted to have you on board. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. It's a little cold here in New York today, but other than that, we're keeping things safe, secure, making sure people are doing what they need to do as part of our protective boundaries that we need to keep in force. So all in all, everything's well.
I like that. And people in very much the multiple, because of course, your work involves larger facilities and larger areas. And that's a topic perhaps we'll come into throughout the day. But our quick starter for 10, 3 quick fire questions. What is the problem you think we're trying to solve when we try to enact corporate security for larger facilities as opposed to, let's say, our EP community?
I think the biggest thing that stands out is the need to understand the holistic sense of security. What is security and keeping people safe? It's the person is one element of that. People, when I look at what my day-to-day work is at the World Trade Center. I work for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey at the World Trade Center. It's a city within a city. So we had pre-COVID 250,000 people going through on a daily basis. So the processes and the staffing required to protect that environment are very different in that we have very large guard forces. We have just enormous security system deployments of cameras and card readers and all of the elements that go into the systems, and then the processes and operating procedures that coalesce to make that an effective protection program. You know, the layered elements are certainly in play the same way that a corporate executive protection agent or a celebrity protector are looking at things, but we look at that at an even larger scale. So really critical infrastructure security at scale. How do you make that larger based on the number of people and the flow that we have in an environment like that? It certainly speaks to the same core ideals and concepts that need to be in play, but we really have to look at it in a larger context. Situational awareness really comes down to the core element of what we have to have there and what supports that situational awareness.
Okay, situational awareness. I love it. Now, I know, and Elijah knows, that you are passionate about it. You know, you're prolific, even on Clubhouse, for example. But where does that passion come from?
So I have a string of points in my life that brought me to where I am to this passion. So I actually started as a child loving the Hardy Boys and all of these wonderful things that as a kid inspired me. But I didn't go that direction in life. I just loved spies and all those things. And I actually spent about 7.5 years in the music business before I went into security. And what I did in the music business was actually run a jazz and classical record label that was called Arabesque Recordings out of New York. They had been around about 20 years. And what I effectively did for 7.5 years was business continuity and figuring out how to take a record label that had done LPs and CDs and take it into the era of digital. And what I figured out after 7.5 years was I didn't necessarily want to stay in that business, but what I had done was business continuity, not the music business. The music was 1%, 99% of it was learning business processes, working with people, all the elements that I learned in school as a saxophone player, all played to this in terms of quantitative concepts. And so I figured out, what can I do now to take my passions as a child of spies and law enforcement and detectives and what I learned in the real world in business after going to school. And I figured out that getting a degree that lends itself towards that, which led me to John Jay College at City University of New York in protection management. And so I really found that business continuity and risk management and security management were the things that drove me towards that point. So I really found just a passion for protecting people. As the eldest brother to 2 younger sisters, having witnessed just through TV, on 9/11, sitting in class, in a music class, and learning about what had happened, just all of these points pushed me to where I then ended up going back to school, figuring out how to make this a real mechanism for me to take the passion, the experience, the expertise, what I had done, and find that it channeled me into security. My first job out of graduate school actually was with a contract security firm working on business continuity and risk, and so it all has led me to here.
Oh, great story.
What would you say then? Because we often talk about transition from the military, transition from else. You've got a unique story, but then equally, I think you've got a lot to teach the rest of the community. What would you say to the uninitiated when they're thinking about business continuity, risk management, and generally protecting large communities? The people that don't know anything about it, what should they know?
I think there's an openness to it. You have to be skilled in understanding how to deal with people. This all comes down to people and what do people's needs entail, and how we communicate with people. It's all goes to the core elements of dealing with people. The security is, as it was in the music business for me, the smallest piece of it. Those are all core concepts, some standardized, some not. We know there's not a lot of standards amongst the industry. They try to coalesce under, as is community guidelines, elements that we can draw together. But if we can understand what drives people, and we, as people with a passion for protecting people and assets and property, can take that and put it together, I think that's really the element we have to convey. And you can learn the things that need to be learned about cameras and card readers and programs and processes and technology, but the passion is where you have to derive that from. One of my earliest research papers in graduate school was about training and oversight of large-scale contract security programs, and it was something I didn't know a lot about at the time. I knew business, I knew what was an appropriate mechanism for dealing in business processes, but how do you apply that? Anybody can do that if you have an MBA, if you have an understanding of business, but that's why I viewed what I did as really, it's a master's of business administration with a specialty in security. So I think that lends itself again to oversight of large security programs. And I think it's just that passion has to be there. We have to be the sheepdogs in this situation.
So I want to dig in on that a little bit, because again, I think your story is inspiring, but also similar in the sense that while traditionally most of us protectors might come from the ranks of law enforcement or come from the ranks of the military and then transition in, there's a segment of our community that, in your instance, you were a musician, then you were in the music business, and then you made that crossover into corporate protection. And as you were doing this, you found these similarities, these traits. And so my question is, for others, whether they're in, again, the music business or the automobile industry or something else, what advice do you have for them if they have an interest in corporate security or any of those related fields, in terms of taking some things that might already be in their toolbox and kind of trying to map them over to get into this part of the business?
That's a sharp question. Oh boy. Getting right to the core of it, Elijah. So one of the things that I really have spoken to, and I've spoken to students looking to finish their degrees. I've taught at John Jay and had students ask this in a similar mechanism, but really it's about understanding what your skill sets are. It's about presenting to corporate executives. It's about communicating the needs of an organization so you can achieve the budgetary needs. So having those skills along with the passion are what have to fit together. When I looked at my music background as a musician and doing years of music theory, the quantitative elements and how you view putting together notes, melodies and harmonies is the same as looking at a risk assessment, the inside out of a system and what you need to do to break it down to make sense of it. All the notes that fit together vertically or horizontally on a piece of staff paper as a musician, it's the same way I need to take a system and understand what might not work as part of it. So if I'm looking at an access control system and I understand the difference between a card reader and a panel and the server that it's running to, and the fiber runs back to the switches, all of those elements, it's just a different physical piece of hardware or logical concept. And as long as we appreciate the content, it really applies across the board. It can be security, it can be anything, which is why when people talk about the idea of insecurity, what do I need to do? Well, find your passion and focus. There are folks I've talked to, and I talk about the security systems with them, and they have a passion for cameras, and they may be a photographer. They love sports. So I've spoken to them and say, well, find a way that you can work in that protection element. There are teams that travel, there are stadiums. When you talk about folks who love music, I've advised about the protection industry, and, to the point of the celebrity touring that you've worked in and spoken to and teach about, that it's just a matter of putting it together in that way. But at the core of it are these, I think what the industry terms as soft skills. I just term them as skills that go along with anything, but the ability to talk, convey, communicate, and obtain the resources we need to achieve that protection.
I love that. And, one of the things I kind of take out from the things that you said, your underlying, outside of, the core duties or roles and responsibilities, the thing that's kind of under the surface is always the love for whatever that is, or the passion. You kind of use that word several times here. And I think that part's important, because if you have that, you can, to your point, if I had a passion for motorcycles and I wanted to be in the protection industry, I could I can structure, I can strategize to try and look for clients that are in that sector, whether that's Harley Davidson or racing in Monaco, you can look for that. And if you're good at the area that you're in, you if nothing else, you have a conversation starter when you're in the interview process. So, if you were a long distance runner, there are companies where the hiring managers are big long distance runners. There are companies where the protectee is a long distance runner. So if nothing else, you can get in at that ground level and say, okay, here's my passion. Now, how can I marry that to the business? And so a lot of people, when they think corporate security, they think, oh, this is mundane or this is boring. But if there's something that drives you into doing this, and again, I want you to speak to this a little bit, if you see that connection there, then you enjoy what you do, and that comes through in your work and in your work product.
That's it 100%. And I think you speak to it very well in your book, even about how do you market yourself? That market is where the passion is. If you're trying to guide yourself into the marketplace, as you're saying, if I love motorcycles, well, I'm going to find a mechanism to do that. If I have a specialty in repairing vehicles, and, how do you put that into it? Well, my background before I joined the Port Authority was with a contract security company. I was going to property management firms in New York City as part of that company, and working with property managers to understand business continuity as well as enterprise risk that they needed to consider. Especially, this was, we're talking now in a post Superstorm Sandy world, and trying to convey what those needs are. But along with that, these are security programs where people are posted at the front of buildings. Well, prior to that, I always was walking into a building in the music business, and there's somebody at the front desk who knew my name, knew everybody else's name, knew what was happening in the building, knew all the ins and outs, and he worked for a security firm. So when I was in that role of overseeing folks with that responsibility, my passion was, how do you work with the public, make them feel comfortable, safe in their environment, so that they don't have to think about these elements. It really is a matter of gearing yourself towards those passionate items and marketing yourself in that appropriate way. I mean, I see us all as protectors. Protector is an overarching term, and it really, I think, brings all of that together.
Sure. So when you talked about, you would, when you have staff or you have employees or people that you're supervising, you're trying to get them to have the same mindset or or motivate them into being in an area where they're vested in that. But one of the things we mentioned at the beginning of this, at the introduction, about where you work at. So the scope and the scale of that, though, is massive. And I think for some, it's hard to kind of wrap their head around that. So how do you kind of, or do you even look at it as massive? Is this just like it's you going to work every day? It's just you going to work, or is it like, man, I'm going to this huge environment that has the attention of the world sometimes on it? Do you feel that weight at all?
I feel that weight every moment. If I'm on site, if I'm not on site, I still work remotely a few days a week in this environment. There is not a moment that my phone isn't dinging or not dinging where I'm thinking about this. Well, I have a unique role there as well, that the security operations centers concept. We actually have what we call a situational awareness communication center, as well as additional security operations centers, one geared towards vehicle screening and one that is embedded within an operations center, where we are looking at cameras and doing access control oversight and communicating amongst ourselves to interdict persons who may be violating access control points or attempting those, and working with law enforcement directly as embeds within the. So I see the physical scope of it every day, but I also make sure to get up from my desk and walk the campus. When I say the campus, the World Trade Center is a 16-acre site, but we have vertical and vertical space that's just enormous. There's 3.5 million square feet in the transportation hub, which connects us to the port. The Port Authority has the PATH trains that run between New Jersey and New York, so that transit center connects our PATH trains to New York City. We also connect to the Metropolitan Transit Authority's New York City subway system. We have, I believe it's 11 subway lines that go to our campus. At Crane, we have the 9/11 Memorial Museum. We have property managers running the office towers there. It's just it's 10 million feet of office space. It's 4 million feet of retail and transportation facilities. And we essentially connect to the entire span of west to east in Manhattan when you connect us to all the other entities that are there. So it really, they're just not just the numbers alone of people that pass through a campus like that, but just the physical space that has to be protected is an enormity that is felt every moment. I mean, we work hand in glove with our own internal Port Authority Police Department. We have the New York City Police Department, the New York National Guard, Empire Shield Task Forces there. We have the, just state police are down there. So we have to work with all these entities, and we understand that the scope of protection is not limited just to what happens within our transit hub. We have to work with all these stakeholders, all these partners, and it really is, as I've termed it to folks, a city within a city. There's small cities that don't have as many people within that space working and living adjacent to the space or traveling through that space on a daily basis. So again, pre-COVID, having 250,000 people daily going through that space is just, it can weigh on you. And there's a lot that happens. We have to be cognizant of every little thing that occurs and work to stay ahead of it, which is why the situational awareness concept is that. But then speaking, again, I love to speak to some elements in your book. You talk about spatial awareness as a protector. So with the massive number of guards, when I talk guards, these are, security guards that are contract folks, or we have vehicle screeners. They have to be supremely aware of what's occurring directly in their space. So when I walk the site, I see what is the command presence of those persons. How do we convey that to the managerial aspect of the contract firms? And then internally, how do we ensure that all of these things are working together? Because it's just a massive space with a lot of people, and it can be porous if you're not attentive to all of those elements.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's massive. So, in your role, as you interact, because I think that our listeners here, some of them's like, oh, wow, I never thought about it like that in terms of how much synergy you need to have with some of the other entities that are also doing business in that space. And so again, whether you're one-on-one as a protector, whose client is, at an award show or at a board meeting. You have a role, but they also have a job to do. And so now let's take you or your staff and realizing that they are in this environment here where security has to be, front and center in your mind. You talk about the pressures that come with it and the history that's around that area. But how do you prevent overdoing it? Am I saying that right?
I think that makes sense.
How do you teach on that? So someone comes in and they say, okay, I understand all the massive responsibilities that come with this. I'm going to make sure I do a great job. But, how do I, but there are people that are commuting. There are people that are sightseeing who've never been to this area before. There are businesses, obviously want, people to come in and spend money there. They're executives, so, the politicians. So how do you calibrate the individuals that are working these sites so that they can do the job, but not overdo the job?
Yeah, we don't want it to be militaristic. We don't want a fortress. We need it to be open and inviting. And so there's a lot of fine lines at a location like ours that are sensitive, with a historical risk profile of, the absolute enormous, terrible, horrible stuff that happened on 9/11. Which to a degree was not a controllable item within the World Trade Center. There's a lot of external factors. There are things about communications that are derived out of that day that I think have been remedied, and those are the things we work towards. But working towards the risk factors of something like a 1993 event, which I think the world now recognizes, when you look at vehicular-borne explosives or a site that requires bollards and interdiction of vehicles if they're trying to enter a site, there's a lot of other considerations. So you have to balance the appropriate countermeasure selection. You have to balance the level of command presence. It really, as you said, it's calibrating all of these elements in an appropriate way. It's working with all of those stakeholders, not dictating to them what that environment needs to look like, but working with them. Setting baselines. One of the things I had a hand in was developing the security guidelines for the campus, derived out of documentation that was developed to design the site again. And I think any environment that somebody is looking to secure needs this. You need to have an overarching plan for a master security plan. You have to have design criteria for what you're building, why you're building it, and then the deployment of assets, of the people assets, of technology assets needs to align with that. And then working with the other stakeholders is important to communicate on a regular basis to ensure that that balance is there. You may be scaling up at certain times based on the protective intelligence that you have, of threat awareness, known vulnerabilities that might have emerged. Hopefully you have that regular communication. You have to set that. One of the things is just regular calls, regular roundtables, regular tabletops and exercises, and ensuring that the entire community is aware of what that threat profile is. But again, you don't want to overwhelm the personnel that are working there. You want to be as invisible as possible. And I think that speaks itself, in every realm of security. We don't want security theater to the point that it just looks overbearing and people don't want to be there, but we need to have that environment secured. So that it's a fine balance. And I think every location, be it the World Trade Center, be it a concert venue, be it a small store, everybody's got to find what that appropriate balance is. You see it now, when you look at armed personnel being deployed to retail locations with a lot of the issues out, especially, you look at San Francisco and areas. What is the appropriate level of deployment that is inviting enough to allow the public to come in and feel safe in whatever context we can provide in this new paradigm, but also ensure that we're providing a level of protection that's appropriate.
Well, I mean, that's a great example. If you think about the, traditional profile of a customer that goes to the Louis Vuitton store, they don't want to have a pat down walking through the door. But, at the same time, from a corporate perspective, Louis Vuitton doesn't want half of their merchandise to run out, because a bunch of teenagers decided to do a flash mob. So it is finding that balance. And I'm sure that's, it's a challenge everywhere, but I'm sure you look at it and have to look at it through a lens of, the magnitude of it. But I think there's some wonderful takeaways there. And I'm sure if you go back and review your camera footage, you'll see I've been out of that site multiple times. But I think one of the impressive things is the fact that and for the listeners who've been there, I think that the majority of the processes that you guys have in place are, unless you're looking with a trained eye, they are blended into the environment. So, so you'll see the physical security, you'll see the uniformed officers, you'll see the Port Authority agents, I don't know if it's National Guard, you'll see them out there walking around, but at the same time, it's still inviting enough for those tourists who are coming there to visit the memorial or to do shopping at the Oculus. They still can go about, even the kids on the skateboarders,
that's a rough one. You raise kids on skateboarders. So I have to speak to skateboarders in particular, and I appreciate the culture that goes with it. The challenge in an environment like ours is twofold, and I've had this discussion and actually stopped skateboarders myself. So technically it is against our rules and regulations to operate a skateboard or any of these kinds of devices, but it's a topic of interest, particularly because it poses two things. One, a safety hazard to the public that's there. And second, although we're a retail environment and a transit environment, we are supremely cognizant of what's occurred there. We want to try and be as calm and peaceful in that environment as possible, and honor it in a way that's appropriate, because we have the pools there, we have the names of the folks, and it really is a sacred ground that, although there is a retail environment meant to help revitalize downtown Manhattan, that we certainly want to ensure that we're honoring it appropriately. So it's a fine balance between all the groups that are there. But skateboarders in particular, I would ask them to go. There's a great skate park on the other side of the West Side Highway built specifically for them. But it's just an interesting thing you brought up. But yeah, it draw all kinds of cultural aspects. It almost brings back, people want to be there, which is a good thing. It's just a matter of again, what's safe, what's desirable, how do we draw those lines appropriately?
But I think even to that though, I'm sure you guys have figured out a technique to do that without creating a bigger problem, or diverting all of your resources over to deal with these kids that want to ride around when there's some other areas that have to be covered. And so I think that speaks to that plan that you guys have in place, and being able to take this big, massive footprint and still, divide up that grid enough that you can address on a micro level, but still pay attention to the macro.
That's exactly it. We have to look at it in that sense. And that's part of why we have levels of what, different security operations groups look at. Our Situational Awareness Center, has oversight for the campus that I oversee. And then we have microcosms within that we have attention toward, but that really is exactly it. We have to have this understanding of what that balance is. And I think in terms of what you bring up resources in this environment are scarce. We have people that aren't coming to the same degree that they were. I think COVID has hit the protection industry in a very unique way, and it hits transit environments and retail environments as well. So what does that deployment look like? I think that you hit on some points there that are really the things that we need to look at for the next couple of years. COVID doesn't look to be going away. So, as an environmental elements, in addition to, as you said, deploying to the level of concern from a microcosm, macro, we have a lot of different things we have to parse out to ensure we're addressing risk appropriately. We're not just throwing things at the wall. The planning, the processes have to be appropriate. But you talk about the plans to address something like that, be it COVID or skateboarders or just the overarching programmatic elements that are regularly in play. There's a plan for everything, and we also plan for what we don't plan for, right? But it's a matter of understanding your operating procedures and how that ties in to the technology and the people that are deployed. So I think it's always the concept, and this just goes back to the core of what we started talking about. For any site, any size, people, process, technology, they all have to be considered, and really how they work together. And you have to parse out different pieces of a campus in our sense, the spatial awareness versus situational awareness, again, to the things that you've spoken about in your book. I think we look at it the same way. A single building has a different consideration than the surroundings of that building. And then when you get to the 16 acres in its entirety, and then what do our neighbors do? We just continue to build that out. And then the vertical as well, what's happening below grade, what's happening above grade, and what's happening in the space above a campus. What's in the sky, what's in the sky around. We've got the west side highway and the buildings on that side, but then we've got the Hudson River. So we have to be cognizant of anything and everything. And so we really have to parse that out. I'm a big proponent of understanding those different elements and how you have to think about each one individually. You can't just look at everything all the time. So while we may be looking at skateboarders, that's only one thing. It's amongst dozens, if not multiple dozens of things.
So Chaim, lots of takeaways, lots of testimony, and you've really brought the environment in which you work to life, which is great. I think everyone's curious, especially about your environment. But in terms of a takeaway, if I might force one, right? I should just ask you what can we take away, but I want to suggest that your skill in scaling security for a large facility, I want to suggest that's a special skill that perhaps a solo operator might not yet have. Being in more than one place at the same time is rather difficult, right? Replicating yourself. These are the sorts of things that small business owners go through, with their teething problems. The army of one, but you can't be everywhere. So I would ask, what can people learn from you in marshalling all these resources and being passionate through the work of others in such a large area?
I think what you're forcing is exactly right. And I appreciate the notation that the skill of doing this at scale. And, you think of the Matrix, and I'll just bring it up because they just came out with the new Matrix, and Agent Smith multiplying himself everywhere, right? So for an individual practitioner in particular, I think the openness to learning beyond even our core work is important. Reading Elijah's book is great. Reading, I know you just put out the new edition of the Dale June EP book is great. So very important things within a solo practitioner's environment to understand, but the openness and understanding that there are other things to learn about. So access control, when you think about residential teams or convert commercial environments, knowing about locks and how those work together in integrated systems with cameras, it's being willing to open your library to all of those other things. And I think that there are numerous resources, be they classes or training opportunities, but really just starting out by reading about it and trying to conceptualize what that means. You don't have to understand all the intricacies of how the system works on the inside. There's a lot of logic internally to it, but in an environment that we're in today and understanding cameras, card readers, intercoms, analytics, bringing all of that to light for a practitioner who works on a smaller scale typically will allow them to understand what their role is in that bigger environment and how they might be able to leverage it. And then eventually, if they're looking to widen their scope and run programs, this will allow them to speak to all of those other elements. And eventually, if you're looking to run a company or have your own company, you would then have the ability to either speak to the expertise that you need to bring to the table as a consultant in those fields, or be able to have that under your purview and really have programs that you can deploy that include that. When you look at countermeasures are people, process, and technology, just opening up the internal willingness to learn about them. It can be difficult because there's a lot to it, but I think with a little pain comes a lot of prosperity. And so I think that's really the goal, to getting to an at-scale understanding of what protection is in any environment.
And obviously, you've made that jump from music to security, which is quite unique. I mean, maybe there's others, right? It's quite special. A lot of people have made the jump from military law enforcement to corporate security, and I think we had Carlos Francisco on last year, and he said, well, one of the difficult things is you had a hierarchical structure where you gave orders, they were taken, and it was implemented, and it was all structured. Suddenly, you arrive in the private sector, you don't have those puppet strings, you don't have all of that.
And I had the opposite. I was a jazz musician who stood on stage with folks, and the improvisation, and this is where I got to disaster recovery, business continuity, security, everything that happened, you had to work with people you may not have worked with before. So it's almost at the other. Instead of being told exactly what you're doing, you get the very loose framework, and it's improvisation. And that's what security and protection end up being, because for all the planning that we do, it's you have to be ready to do the opposite. So in the other instance, I think it makes perfect sense, and Carlos has his book on moving, into the corporate environment. I think anybody can move into this space, and it really, it's just a matter of the passion and openness to educating oneself. Again, be it going to get a degree is one thing. I had the benefit of going to school and getting a master's in a field that that allowed me to look at fire science, security management, and emergency management. But going to learn at Vehicle Dynamics Institute and learning how to drive and becoming an executive driver, however you're approaching it, you just need to be willing to take in all the information and synthesize it and make it work to actually get into the field. And that openness will work with the passion, and it'll lead you there. I think really there's a lot of ways in. And the passion is, I speak about passion because I want that to be for the guard in the field who needs to understand that there is a push towards professionalization. I think that's the goal. And there's a lot of opportunities for them. They don't, if they want to be a guard in the field forever, they could do that and maybe move. If they want to move to supervision, it's the same concept. You have a passion for protecting people. You continue to learn your operating procedures, and if you want to be, again, in the technology space, you may just at this point be an operator at a console. But if you learn more about cameras and systems, you may be able to elevate yourself to run those command centers. So I think any person with a passion can work towards it. You need to really be open to the educational aspect. But I think you can be in the military, the law enforcement. You can be a civilian who's never been in it. You can identify the skills as I worked to in what I had already done to bring that to the table. But at the center of it are two things: a passion for protecting people and property. People need that and may not be aware of the need for it. And so we need to be able to communicate that. And then how do we bring that educational component in order to do that? And that's just a willingness on our part.
So you've given a great idea. I'm sure Elijah's on board. We're going to rename this episode Security Improv or something like that. No, maybe not.
I had a different one, but okay, keep going. We'll talk about it after.
No, this is great. And of course, we look forward to hearing more from you on Clubhouse and everything you do. I know your friend Josh Phillips is also, prolific. So really, really enjoy that side of the house. But this is nice. This is good. We're combining, yes, a venue that everyone is curious about and perhaps want to, work in conjunction with, but the story of large scale versus perhaps the humble individual operator that has a one-on-one task. I think that's a good dichotomy to bring to the magazine, and I'm really pleased we investigated it. What's next for you, Chaim?
I'm going to continue what I'm doing, keeping people safe and secure. I really need to just buckle down in this environment and make sure that with budgets where they are, with people still concerned, that we're ensuring that people feel secure and safe in their environments, be it at work, at home, anywhere. I just think that we need to be cognizant of that. And as we head over, we've got my emergency management side is ticking, as we get closer and closer to these other times of year on the East Coast, when we've got nor'easters and then we head towards hurricane season. There's a lot of other things that can occur that need to be thought about. So I just put my head into the work and hope that we can continue these conversations in a demonstrable way to keep people safe and secure and feel comfortable that we're out there thinking about them and ensuring their well-being.
Good stuff.
Love it. Well, from Elijah and myself, thank you very much for joining us. This has been
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you on, and this has been another fantastic edition of the Circuit Magazine podcast. Well, I've definitely got to get on another Clubhouse episode between Elijah and Chaim. It's on a little bit late for the UK, but I really, really enjoy that discussion. It's actually been a really interesting episode, Sean, because, you know, working in a very large corporation, there are certain levers that you sort of know and trust that perhaps the smaller company, it's not comparable. I'd be interested in your thoughts about scaling and, you know, at least what Chaim's message is about scaling yourself, you know, have in terms of relevance for our EP community.
Yeah, and it was good to hear his thoughts on that, and I couldn't agree more. If you're scaling, you're getting bigger, your team is growing. You need to have a good team ethos. You need to have trust in your team, good clear lines of command, and if you're at the top of that tree, you need to lead by example. So as the team's growing, you might not always have that face-to-face interaction with them because they may be working on another continent or another town or another property or whatever that may be. But every time they see you, you should be leading by example, and they should know what you expect. It was really good to hear that. And if you are working over several different continents and you can't always get there in person, there's a lot of tools available to us as well. As we've seen during the lockdown, there's no excuse for not being able to communicate. We have Zoom, Teams, some fantastic radio systems now that work off cellular systems, so you can keep in contact with your team at any time. So yeah, good team ethos, good chain of command, good communication is essential scaling any operation.
And I feel, by extension, that's an interesting tidbit or piece of advice for the whole EP community, because even if you're a solo operator, you might have dreams of building out a company. And you might say, well, how could I ever scale myself? I'm the brand of one, the army of one. How has that been for you and for people you know?
It's interesting because that's exactly what's happened with me in my business. I named my business after myself, and the reason I'd done that and put my name in the title was I wanted to be proud of everything that I'd done. And I thought it just meant wherever I went, or whoever I sent out to operate or work for me, I would only put people there that I would know would work to the highest standards. And I thought by having my name there at the forefront, I'd want to maintain control of that, of who's employed, and I think I'm a medium-sized business, so I still have kind of control of everyone that comes through me through recommendation or people I've worked with or team members that have worked with them. But I think once you get past that, medium to large, that's when it starts getting a little bit more difficult to manage. But when you're starting a new business, and the question you asked was, how do you scale yourself? I think it's a difficult one. I think definitely we should probably get a few people in on a podcast for that. I think that's a one for another episode for sure.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. Well, let me find a few people, round them up, and we'll have a good session on that. But separately, it's all go with the NABA Protect app and the BBA Connect app, as well as the latest edition. It's hit the shelves, so really, really enjoying reading that. What else have we got coming up that we want people to sort of take note of?
Well, we all know the magazine, we all know the podcast, but not everyone has signed up to our newsletter, the Circuit newsletter called On the Circuit, which comes out weekly. And I know give John a shout out. He puts a lot of work into that every week, bringing lots of information. And I've never been a big fan of newsletters. When people bombard your inbox, it's not like that. There's some great bits of information in there, all of interest. So definitely worth signing up for. If you go to the Circuit Magazine website, it's right at the top of the page. Get your email address on there and get signed up to that and see what we've got to say.
Perfect. We'll do that. That's our ask for you, the community, to have some fantastic free content coming through every week, very, very carefully curated. So absolutely recommended. Well, thanks very much to today's guest, Chaim Roberts. It's a pleasure to have him on. And I think, this is a key topic. Lots of people will end up some stage in their career working for a giant corporation or a really large organization. And so this is really relevant. From Sean and myself, this has been another fantastic edition of the Circuit Magazine podcast.
You have been listening to the Circuit Magazine podcast. Be sure to subscribe and be sure to not miss an episode.